So the first of our, I guess, controversial amendments for some folks is Amendment 4. And Amendment 4 has to do with initial petition ratification. It doesn't have to do anything with how an initial petition gets on the ballot. It's just how it's ratified by the people. And in Article 5, or excuse me, Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution, every single state is guaranteed to have a representative, or be a representative, and have a Republican, not a Republican Party, smaller Republican form of government. And what that means is that we the people don't make every single decision. We elect our representatives, like Darin, like Representative Jamie Gregg, to go to a legislative body and be part of our state and local governments in order to help to make decisions to where we're not going to the people every single time a decision has to be made. That's just an unworkable form of government. And so what we have in initial petition ratification currently is we have, if enough signatures are gathered, I think it's about 8% of registered voters in the state, those signatures are gathered, the Secretary of State certifies them, they're all our registered voters, all legal signatures and correct. And so then that initial petition, whatever the people want to have on the ballot gets on a ballot. And then the governor decides whether to have a special election, whether to have that voted on in an April election, municipal election, or in a primary election like in August, or a general election in November. So currently, we have, all it takes in order to get an initial petition ratified and into the state constitution is a 50% plus one vote of the people. And that is not a vote of that's not 50% of all the registered voters. That's 50% plus one of the voters that show up for that election, either that day or vote early in that election. And if you look at historically in Missouri's pretty much like most other states, in a presidential election, we have anywhere between 60 and 70% turnout of registered voters. In a midterm, like what we're having, what's coming after now, that number's between 40 and 50% typically. And so what that means is that we're having 25% of the population in the midterm year basically decide a constitutional issue for the whole entire state. Obviously in a presidential term, a presidential election year, we're looking around like 30 to 35%. So this is a small minority, and there's lots of problems. There's lots of problems that could be stated about that. One, that there's such a low turnout in voters in an election when we're selecting our elected leaders. Then the other thing is that you have a minority of people that are actually making decisions for the whole entire state. And it's writing something in our Constitution that more than likely belongs in state statutes. So what we have is the last amendment that's gone through initial petition that could be considered to be a conservative limited government issue was the Hancock Amendment. The Hancock Amendment was passed in 1980. So that's 46 years ago by my public education calculation. So since then, what has happened is that our state constitution has virtually been up for sale. There have been all kinds of groups that have funneled in outside money, and yes, for some of these amendments, there are conservative groups that are funneling outside money into the state of Missouri. The distinction is that some of these issues that are getting into our Constitution are issues that clearly vary with the intent and the will of Missouri voters. And we know that because of how Missouri voters vote and elect their elected officials and their representatives in Jefferson City in the House and the Senate. So what we have had in the last 46 years, some of the things that have gotten into our Missouri Constitution are bingo. I like bingo. That's a lot of fun to play. also have marijuana legalization, and that's supposed to be medical marijuana, but you just drive down any street in Springfield, roll down your window and take a whiff, you know, it's widespread legalization. That is in the state constitution. We have also had one of the things that actually was reversed was puppy mills. Puppy mills were put in, a ban on puppy mills was put in the state constitution several years ago. And you'll see people out, you know, taking petition signatures. You're just like, hey, do you like puppies? Well, yeah. Well, you need to sign this bill, this petition about puppies. Okay. So then they gather the signatures. Well, and I like puppies too. I'm a dog person. I don't want to see violence to animals. But one of the extensions of that puppy bill was actually regulating livestock. So it would place regulations on how a farmer, say like a dairy farmer, how they had to keep their livestock, to the point of whenever it was wintertime, the livestock all had to be brought inside and kept in a heated environment. When it was nice and sunny, warm like this out here, like it is today, they would have to be brought inside and be kept in a climate controlled air conditioned environment. Okay? These are animals. Okay? But this is an extension of what they put under this umbrella of this puppy mill bill. Thankfully that's not in the Constitution anymore, that's been overturned. But what we have is we have so many things that belong in state statutes, which are the laws of the state, that are actually in the Constitution. And a state constitution or national constitution, any country's constitution, is to enshrine principles and structure and define jurisdictions of where government decisions are made. It's not designed to have mechanics. It's not designed to have the minutia in how policy is implemented. It's supposed to set those parameters, and then the legislature, or sometimes the people who initial petition, can then write the mechanics into state statutes. The problem with this is, once something gets in the Constitution, it is incredibly difficult to get out. The only way you can remove something from the Constitution is another constitutional amendment, which in this environment requires that 50% plus one majority. Now, how have these things gotten into our Constitution? Well, they've gotten into the Constitution. Marijuana legalization, I think, passed in 13 or 14 counties. All of them around St. Louis, Kansas City, and Columbia. And I think Springfield, I think Greene County was about a 50-50 split. So what we have is those major metropolitan cities, and now Springfield is one of those, that are getting issues put into our state constitution that are opposed to the overall values and the voting patterns of Missourians. And so that is why a lot of these groups, and the groups are mainly from the left, they are going through initial petition to try to enshrine these issues in the Constitution that they know that they cannot get through the legislature, and they know they can't get this through the legislature because that's not the will of the people. Again, from the voting patterns. So what Amendment 4 looks to do is have a 50% plus one majority vote to ratify any initial petition initiated by the citizens by a 50% plus one vote in all 8 federal congressional districts. So that would be basically, obviously that would speak to the whole entire state. And that is a very high bar, but I think that if I look at if you look at what has happened with our Constitution, that's one of the reasons why our state Constitution is in a volume about 2.5 to 3 inches thick. There's all kinds of stuff in there that does not belong in there. And the important thing to note is it's not, the people are not losing their voice in Missouri politics, because Amendment 4 has absolutely nothing to do with initial petitions that put issues in state statutes. anything that goes to state statute still takes a 50% plus one statewide vote. And I would make this analogous to, if you look at, and the principle behind this, if you look at the Electoral College, the purpose of the Electoral College, the framers put in the Constitution, was so nationally elected officers, the president, vice president, would be elected not by individual factions within the country, but they would have both a broad-based geographic and a broad-based political support throughout the country. Otherwise, what ends up happening is you have a minority, possibly in large municipal areas, that are selecting our national chief executive and not representing and basically ignoring some of the flyover country, like what Missouri is, and the broader population. So that is the purpose for Amendment 4 in the change to the initial petition process for citizen-initiated petitions for issues to go into the state constitution only. And that will tie into, I'm sure Darin will probably have some things to say about that, because Amendment 4 definitely ties into Amendment 5 as well. And be happy to take your questions after Darin's presentation on Amendment 5. Thank you.
The hardest thing about this for me is I have to stand here instead of moving around. I kind of like that. Static speaking is not my strong suit. Amendment 4, if I can. Amendment 4 only deals with initiative petition as it relates to constitutional amendments, not to statutory changes. If enough people get together and say, hey, there ought to be a law, that's still there. We want that to be there. Nobody wants to change that. This is only about constitutional amendments. The Constitution is not supposed to be changeable as easily, frankly, as Missouri's had since 1945. The U.S. Constitution has only been amended 27 times since 1789. That's it. 10 of those all happened at once. December 15th, 1791. First 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, they all went in at the same time. That only leaves 17. And then we've had the 27th Amendment, which was originally part of the 10, but it didn't get ratified right away. And then some high school student in Texas said, hey, this is still on the books. What if we ratified it? And they finished it up. So the 27th actually goes with the first 10 as well. It only leaves 16. And then we had an amendment for allowing blacks to vote and women to vote and 18-year-olds to vote, each one of those coming along at a time wherein the society changed dramatically and the Constitution needed to be amended to reflect the dramatic changes in society at the time. It only leaves 13. One of them was for prohibition. And then a few years later, they realized that all prohibition ever did was create the mafia and NASCAR. And they said, hey, let's take that back out. So they did away with prohibition. So that only leaves 11. Out of the 27 amendments that there are to the United States Constitution, only 11 of them are not in those 3 batches of items. None of them dictate the how. They say this is what the Constitution is going to declare, and then it's up to the legislature to dictate the how. It's up to the states to dictate the how. But there is no, in the Constitution, it just says that there is the right to free speech and freedom of religion and to redress grievances and to assemble peaceably shall not be infringed. But it doesn't say the how. It doesn't talk about permits. It doesn't talk about waivers. It doesn't talk about any of that. It doesn't mention anything about slander or libel or any of that. It just simply says shall not be infringed by the United States Congress. And it doesn't put the details in the amendment to the Constitution, because the Constitution is not supposed to have the details like that in it. A Constitution, from the framing of our nation to this very day, is supposed to be the framework of how government exists, how government works, and what are the boundaries and limitations on that governmental power that is executed by those we elect to represent us. And that's it. The details belong in the law, the legislation that's passed. And the reason why that's true is really, really important to understand. The Constitution is and ought to be difficult to change. Legislation, we make a mistake, we can fix it. You know, something was unforeseen. We weren't planning on this particular outcome, because everything is like a pond of water. You can throw the pebble in wherever you like, but you don't control where the ripples go. And so by having something being done legislatively, well, then we can correct for that. That doesn't have to fundamentally alter who and what we are as a people. But when you go to amending the Constitution, that changes everything. Absolutely everything. 1913, maybe the worst year in the history of the United States, three things happened. They created the income tax on the national level with the 16th Amendment. They made senators be elected by a vote of the people directly, rather than going through state legislatures like had been done for the previous era of the United States existence, more than 125 years. And it created the Federal Reserve. And if you look from 1913 onward, that's when the spending in this country began to go astronomical, because they had the power to tax, they had the power to print money at will, and they had senators that answered to the people along with the congressmen. See, prior to that, the senators answered to the states, the state government, and Congress, the House of Representatives, they answered to the people. And if you had a bill that the people supported, that the state supported, and a president was willing to sign, that's pretty good and necessary legislation, or it wouldn't have had all that support. When we took away representation of the state governments and gave a double dose of representation of the people, of both the Senate and the House, from that moment forward, the Senate and the House began to try to outdo one another, to outspin one another, to gain the support of the people, because they just keep wanting to get reelected. And I love when some of my colleagues inside the state of Missouri and some of my individuals who represent us all at the national level and at the national level is say, hey, we need term limits. And I always want to say, hey, you do know you don't have to run again, right? I mean, you could just sit one out. That'd be okay. You can do that. They don't ever really want to seem to do that. Everybody's concerned about term limits for somebody else. But they never recognize that they themselves may indeed be part of the problem. So Amendment 4, just to wrap this up before I move into Amendment 5, what Amendment 4 does, it just simply says, look, the Missouri State Constitution has been made out of Play-Doh. It's not a bedrock. It's Play-Doh. And it has been formed and reformed and shifted and twisted into various shapes based on simple votes of a majority of voters who showed up that day. Christian County, just last year, one of their school districts passed a sales tax increase. Not sales tax, property tax increase. And everybody was foaming at the mouth about their property taxes going up, and I understand because they're crazy high. Does anybody know what the voter turnout was in Christian County when the voters approved that property tax increase? I'm sorry? 10%? 8? 4. 4%. But let us remember this. That's only 4% of registered voters. Most people who could be eligible voters don't bother to. Only half of the possible voters are actually registered. So when you're looking at a 4% voter turnout of registered voters, It's actually a 2% turnout of people who could and should participate. 2%. A simple majority of 2% is 1% plus one person decided that everybody's taxes was going to go up. And guess who did show up? Everybody who worked for the school district. Which is fine. That's their right. But if people don't get out to vote, I don't know what to tell them. If you don't want your taxes to go up and you can't be bothered to vote, I will listen and smile and nod politely, but inside I'm thinking to myself, what in the world's wrong with you? Get out and vote. If everybody would just simply show up and vote, that couldn't happen. But the same thing is true when we amend the Constitution to the state of Missouri. So I am the chairman of the subcommittee of the budget in the House. I'm the chairman of the subcommittee that deals exclusively with health, mental health, and social services. Half the budget crosses my desk. I have the biggest piece of everybody. And I deal with Medicaid, I deal with child care, I deal with everything within health, mental health, and social services. And a few years back, there were individuals out there with clipboards at Walmart, right? And they were asking everybody, you know the ones, the kids from out of state with hair halfway down their back, look like they hadn't seen a brush in 6 months. They're out there with a clipboard asking you to sign, and we're going to help poor folks. And here in the Ozarks, most of us are good-hearted, decent people. And so we said, well, I want to help poor folks. So we signed. And it gets on there, we're going to have expanded Medicaid. We're going to extend Medicaid. Now, Medicaid originally was for children in poverty, pregnant women in poverty, and people with disabilities of all ages. That's what Medicaid was for, and I'm all about it. It's a safety net for the most fragile among us in society. I've got no problem with Medicaid. But Medicaid expansion included anybody and everybody who just didn't make very much money. Now, I'm sure all of your children and grandchildren are hardworking, industrious individuals who put forth their best effort, all times. But now we all have that one nephew. Right? We'll have that one nephew that just doesn't want to work very hard. And then we see the folks out here on the corner weighing about 335 with sign says, we'll work for food. Well, we know that's not true because there's 10 or 12 help wanted signs all around them and they won't. They qualify now for Medicaid. So here's a statistic that is new and is 100% true. You can check it out for yourself if you don't believe me, although I've never lied to you. I mean, I won't lie to you. There are 6.2 million people in the state of Missouri. 1.4 million of them are on Medicaid now. That's more than 1 out of every 5 people that you meet, they are on Medicaid. And if you have a family and none of your folks are on Medicaid, just think how that doubles up in other families. And how we're training people to become more and more reliant on the government, which is a recipe for disaster for everybody involved. Medicaid is the 800-pound monster that will eat us alive if we don't get this under control. But I can't touch it because it was put into the Constitution by the voters. Furthermore, we said, okay, well, all right, the voters passed that, but they did not identify a funding source. The Missouri State Constitution requires, Article 3 requires the voters pass initiative petition that's going to require expenditures by the state. Then the petition itself must identify the pot of money that's going to come out of. No such identification occurred. There was no pot of money identified. And so the Supreme Court should have struck it down right at the very beginning. But we can't rely on the court to do what the Constitution says for some crazy reason. That's just the way that works. So it passed, and the representatives and the Senate said, well, okay, but we're not going to fund it. And the Supreme Court came back and said, you must fund it. Not only that, you must fund it first. So if we're going to reduce expenditures on Medicaid, then we have to have the reduction of expenditures on the little kids in wheelchairs before I can touch the guys out there holding signs. I cannot reduce the expenditures on individuals on the expansion until we reduce the expenditures on those who actually were the ones for whom Medicaid was created. And I'm sorry, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I couldn't care less. That is insane. And it's cruel, and it's heartless, and it ought never be tolerated. But those are the handcuffs I'm wearing as the chairman of that subcommittee. And that was put in by the voters. And people say, well, why don't you just cut the budget? Well, we did. We cut the budget by $4.11 billion this year. It's almost 8% cut this year. Nobody knows, and nobody's given any credit for that effort. They said, how come you don't cut? Well, in large part because so many things are outside of the control of the General Assembly. We can't touch that part of the budget. Like Medicaid, can't touch it. Education. 1 out of every $4 brought in general revenue in the state of Missouri must, constitutionally mandated, must be spent on education. 25% of all general revenue receipts has to go to education right off the bat. MoDOT. Everybody real happy with MoDOT these days? The road conditions? Everybody's good with that? And yet MoDOT's budget not only is outside of the purview of the General Assembly for it to be addressed, but the Supreme Court ruled that MoDOT stands appropriated. They don't even have to come ask us another may I to be able to get the money and spend it. And they don't care what we think when we do say something. The Conservation Department, likewise, have no control over their budget whatsoever. Do you know why I don't have any control over MoDOT or the Department of Conservation or educational spending or Medicaid? Does anybody know why? Because the voters put those things into the Constitution time and time and time again. Now, I believe in the voice of the people, vox populi. But can we all agree, and I don't care which side of the political spectrum we're on, when President Obama won as president, a big chunk of the country thought the people got it wrong. And when President Trump won as president, the other side thought they got it wrong. Can we all agree that sometimes, just sometimes, the people, because of their own personal biases, or because they didn't show up to vote, or because they were misled in some way, can we all agree that from time to time, the voters get it wrong? I mean, if we can't be honest with ourselves, what are we doing here, right? So what Amendment 4 does, as Brett said, is it changes the way in which only constitutional amendments are approved. Now, Brett said this, and I don't mean to belabor the point, but people say, well, how can we get our ideas in, constitutional amendments, if we can't have IP? Again, the Constitution should not be being changed like it has been. Should not be. I said that the U.S. Constitution since 1789 has only been amended 27 times. The Missouri State Constitution has been in effect since 1945. Does anybody know how many amendments we have since 1945? 126, actually. With these 4 on the ballot, and there are, to my understanding, there's more than 100 in the Secretary of State's office ready to go. We have lost our ever-loving minds as it relates to how a Constitution is supposed to be framed and how it's supposed to be working. So the idea that the Constitution ought to be amended by 50% plus 1 vote, I think is extraordinarily short-sighted. And so Amendment 4 is set up to correct that. And we get to the question and answer part. I'm happy to answer